From the bottom of my heart as your pastor, I just want to say welcome home. We thank you so much. I also want to thank our online community for being with us this morning. That online community is growing like crazy. And so we just thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. And I don't know if you know this, but we also have podcasts. And so we say thank you for listening to our podcast community. And we're going to get ready to get to the word. You ready for the word? You ready for the word? Hey, we're going to be talking about something called when God does not make sense. Let's say that again. Hey, let's start it on the screen. When God does not make sense. Can anyone say I've been there? Like, sometimes it just doesn't make sense. Come on, this is a dialogue church. This is not just a monologue, so y'all got to talk back to me every now and then. It's funny, we picked this sermon 2 weeks ago. We said, there was just some stuff in my heart. And I said, I think I just want to talk about when God doesn't make sense. And then we had the news on Friday about this community where 2 students from our community tragically lost their lives in a car accident. And sometimes you can ask yourself, well, God, why would you allow that to happen? Why? I mean, they were 17 years old. Why would you allow that to happen? Sometimes God just doesn't make sense. I was driving in my car about 3 weeks ago, and I got one of those touch screens, the little touchscreen dash. And while I was driving, it went out. And I said, oh, man. And so I did one of these, and y'all did, God, please, let this thing come back on. And you ever prayed a prayer like that concerning your car? And I said, God, please, when I get back in this car, let it work. So I ain't driving for like 2 or 3 days. I was like, I'm exercising my faith. And I got back in the car, and I pulled one of these. You ever reach your hand real slow? Like just hoping that thing was going to come back on. And lo and behold, it came back on. And I didn't really get excited at that moment. I actually started writing this sermon because I started thinking about, God, why would you answer a prayer that's seemingly so insignificant, like fixing my car dash radio? But there's people who are sick, that's potentially getting ready to pass, and you want to answer that prayer. God, you'll answer my prayer for my headache, but you still haven't restored my marriage. God, you'll answer my prayer to help me find my keys, but I got a child that I'm still praying to come home. Sometimes God doesn't make sense. Me or no? Am I by myself today? And so I wanted to share a message about this guy named Apostle Paul. I promise I'm going to explain to you who he is because it's pretty miraculous, but I looked at his life and God began to reveal to me 3 things about prayer and 3 things that we can learn about prayer. So here's the first one. I'm going to give it to you real quick. Here's the first one. That true prayer isn't about having our way, but it's about surrendering our will. True prayer isn't about having our way and God just doing things because we want him to do it. Sometimes true prayer is really just surrendering your will to his. We learned this, of course, through Jesus. Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane. And let me tell you, don't get caught up on the word Gethsemane. Just know this, that while he was in this garden, they was getting ready to take him to go die on a cross. And he knew that he was getting ready to endure probably the most brutal punishment we have ever experienced, that anyone has ever experienced. He was innocent. He was going to go die on a cross. And he prayed a prayer that I probably would have prayed. He said, if there's any way, God, that I don't have to endure this, then please let this thing pass me by. Anyone ever prayed that? God, please, if I ain't got to go through this, if there's any other way, let's have another way. But then he added something to this prayer that I'm still trying to work on. He said, nevertheless, not my will be done, but your will. Jesus was hanging out with the disciples. These are just people that was hanging with him. There was 12 of them in general. And they said, Jesus, won't you teach us how to pray? And he said, okay, won't you do this? Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. thy will be in God. See, sometimes our prayer is not about getting our own way. Sometimes prayer is literally about saying, God, what's your way for me? I told you I was going to talk to you about the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul, more than anyone else, probably deserved to have his prayers answered. The Apostle Paul, before his name was Paul, actually was Saul. And Saul used to persecute Christians like no other. He hated, if you think you hate Christians, he hated Christians. He made it his life's mission, Pop, to make sure that he could literally stone, kill, and imprison any Christian that he saw. And then one day he was traveling this road, and I don't want to get too much into what occurred, but he heard the audible voice of God say, why are you persecuting me? And this guy, Saul, went to be calling himself Paul, and he said, you know what? I'm not going to persecute Christians anymore. He went from being a persecutor of Christians to probably one of the most effective Christians to ever live this earth. It's the Bible you have the Old Testament, and you have the New Testament. The New Testament that starts in the book of Matthew, Apostle Paul wrote half of the New Testament. Half of it. He became one of the most effective people ever, but it cost him something. He spent the last 20 years of his life on a ship, going from continent to continent, preaching the gospel. But with that came being thrown in prison. With that came fighting malaria. With that came being flogged 5 different times. Now, to be flogged meant that you were going to be beat across your back 39 times. They wouldn't do it 40 because if they killed you, then they would be arrested for murder. So they did 39. He went through that 5 different times, fought sickness. Then he got stoned, not recreationally. He got stoned to death. He got stoned to death. So you would think that if anyone would pray to God and get an answer, it would be this guy. Yeah? Like, I mean, you think about everything he's endured. If he asks for a prayer, it's like, you know God going to come through for him. And yet we find him writing in 2 Corinthians chapter number 12. 2 Corinthians chapter number 12, verse number 7. He says this. We got the Bible up here on the screen for you. He says, so to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given to me in the flesh. Say a thorn. A thorn was given to me in the flesh. Now, here's the deal. We don't know what the thorn was. Y'all ever heard the expression, a thorn in my side? We don't know what the thorn was. Theologians are just people who study the Bible. They have tried to debate what this thorn was. Some say that it was malaria. Some say that it was a temptation that he couldn't overcome. Some say that it was headache. Some think it was epilepsy. No one really knows what the thorn was, but we know that there was a thorn there. And in the Greek, this word thorn just translates to mean stake, not the one you eat, but the one like a spear. You with me? And so we don't know what it was, but what we do know is that whatever it was agonizing. It was grueling. Many of you all got a thorn in your life. If it's the person next to you, just keep looking at me. Just stay straight. Just stay straight. We're going to get through this. Look. Many of you all have a thorn in your life. It could be a job instance. It could be finances. Maybe it's a situation. You praying for just a steady finances. You praying to get provision. You're praying for a marriage. I don't know what it is, but there's a thorn that all of us have in our life. And Apostle Paul was saying that man, Satan brought this thing to my life, and God, I've been asking for you to remove it, and for some reason it's not being removed. Have you ever prayed for something and you know God can do it? Matter of fact, you've seen him do it for other people. Yet it still remains in your life. What do we do when God just doesn't make sense? I know you can do it. I believe you can do it, but it's still here. I'm still messing and fighting and grueling over this thorn. Brings us to my second point, that prayer sometimes, it reminds us that we're not in control, but it keeps us close to the one who is. Sometimes prayer reminds us that we're not in control, but it keeps us close to the one who is. Here's what I know about trials and tribulations and thorns, that sometimes they're brought here in our lives for a greater purpose than what we might think. Sometimes God allows us to experience things for a greater purpose than we could ever understand. I remember I was in St. Louis for about 2 years at a ministry that I thought I was going to love. And it was the hardest 2 years of my life, Charles. I cried myself to sleep. It was painful. I was away from my family. God was just, I felt like he was nowhere near to be found. I'm praying and he ain't saying nothing. Anyone ever been there? Like, why in the world won't you say anything to me? Don't you hear me praying to you every night about how painful this journey is? About how painful this situation is? And I'm asking you, please, to bring this out. Why is it the same? And I'm crying. And sometimes we got addictions that we're trying to break. God, why won't you break this thing up off me? You know I want to do better. Check this out. Paul said this in verse number 8. He says, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. Now, the 3 times that he was praying, it's not like he prayed at breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It's not like he prayed Monday, Wednesday, Friday. This guy spent 3 specific seasons of his life praying for this thorn. I mean, spending months praying for the same thing. This thorn had become his prayer priority, and yet it still would not leave. Are you serious? I got to be preaching to the choir. There's got to be some things in our life that we've been praying for so that God would change the situation. It still hasn't changed. Many of our prayers sound like this, like, God, just remove this for me, please. And if you do this, then I know things will be better. And so here Apostle Paul is, he's praying like, God, please take this thing from me. This is the guy who literally, he was bitten by snakes, he was flogged, he was left beaten, left good as dead. And here he is praying to God. And he was doing this not because he was wrong, but because he was advancing the gospel. And yet he's praying about this thing, and it seems like God won't answer his prayer. And look at the next verse, watch this. He says, but he said to me, this is God, he says, my grace is sufficient for you. He's praying, God, please take this away. And God's response is, no, my grace is enough. See, sometimes God won't change the situation because that situation is, he's put that there to change you. Sometimes God will remove the thorn because he's put that thorn there so that you can know who he is. See, he's saying, look, you don't need me to change the situation. You need to know who I am. Okay, let me see if I can get a little realer. If you got the job when you want it, then you wouldn't know God is your provider. You see, if your mom didn't pass, if your brother didn't pass, you wouldn't know God as your comforter. You see, sometimes God allows things to happen in our life because he wants to show another side of himself. This word grace, it means kairos in Greek. Kairos means it's the leaning in of God. It's the drawing close of him, not because you deserve it, but because he loves you. Someone come up here. Come here, you. Get up here. This is what grace looks like. Without grace, that's what you look like. With grace, me as God, this is what it looks like. Him leaning in and being a part of your life. What am I saying? Sometimes our worst storms come just so we can feel the presence of God. Just so we can know what the presence of God looks like. He wants to lean in and tell you that I'm with you. See, sometimes we got to be left by a boyfriend or a girlfriend so that we know what it means when he says, didn't I tell you I'll never leave you nor forsake you? See, a lot of times our toughest situations are here just so God can show more of himself. What does prayer do? Prayer reminds us that we're not in control, but it draws us close to the one who is. It draws us close to the one who holds our entire life in his hands. Here's number 3. Prayer is not just asking, it's trusting. Prayer is not just asking, it's trusting. If you came to me and you said, hey, I've got cancer, undoubtedly, I'm going to believe that cancer can leave because of God's miraculous power. I'm going to believe that God can heal whenever he wants to, that God can change any situation. The name of Jesus is above every name, and that every other name must bow. But truthfully, sometimes God doesn't answer. Sometimes his answer is no. And when his answer is no, we don't stop asking in the future, but more importantly, we don't stop trusting right now. See, prayer is about asking God to do something, but trusting regardless of what the answer is. So even if it doesn't go our way, we still trust. Even if it doesn't happen the way we wanted it to, we still trust. Prayer is asking and trusting, asking and trusting. Here's what the Apostle Paul realized. I think this is so cool. Apostle Paul is writing to the church of Corinth in the verses we just read, but this is way after the thorn. I mean, he still has this thorn, and he's writing presently with the thorn. And here's what he says. Let's keep reading. Watch this. The thorn is still in his side. It isn't moved. And he says, no, go back to verse 9, Bree. He says, look, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. He's saying, look, I have learned that when I am weak, when I feel like I can't move on by myself, that's when God becomes stronger. Now watch this. Keep going. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. Another version says this: I delight in weaknesses. I delight in insults. I delight in hardships. I delight in persecutions. I delight in calamities. Here's what Paul is saying. He's writing with this thorn in his side, but he says, look, the thing that tormented me most, I now find the greatest joy in. Why? Because God used this thing that tormented me for my good. It kept me from being conceited. What happened? Perspective changed. Any of y'all ever heard this? Time heals all wounds. Y'all heard that? Forget it. It's a lie. How do I know? Because there's people still mad at you right now for something you did years ago. Here's the truth. Time with God's presence heals all wounds. Time with God's presence. He prayed over and over, God, please deliver this thorn from me. And he said, no, I'm not going to do this, but my grace is sufficient for you. My grace is sufficient for you. And so then he got perspective. He was able to look back and say, wait a second. It was because of this thorn that I wasn't able to become conceited. I don't know what you're going through at this moment. I don't know what you have endured. I don't know what you've encountered. I don't know how hard life is. But I can tell you this, that after some time with God's presence, you'll be able to step back and say, wait a second. I see what you did there. I see why that was brought into my life. I see why you allowed those things to happen. Because here's the truth. Sometimes you don't really know how good God is until God is all you have left. Sometimes you don't know what it's like to stand just with God until you're forced to leave a situation. See, God is not after your convenience. He's after your calling. He's after your purpose. And sometimes there's some things that you will go through that God is using for your purpose. That's why this same Apostle Paul was able to write, but now I know that all things work together for the good of those who are called according to his purpose. What he was saying, that no matter what you're going through in time, it works for your favor. It works for your favor. It works for who you are. But again, I don't know how bad the situation is. But I do know that it can't be worse than the goodness of God. I do know that it can't be bigger than our God. If you got big problems, you serve an even bigger God. And God isn't always trying to bring you to the place where you get everything you want, as much as he's trying to bring you to a place where you realize he's all you need. That he is all you need. So what do? We're going to pray, knowing that it's God who's in control. We're going to pray knowing that it's not about us having our own way, but it's about us surrendering to the way that God wants us to be. And then we're going to trust, knowing that regardless of the situation, regardless of how it plays out, that God is still good, that he's still faithful, that he's still in control. Because our God is greater than any situation we could ever face. I want to say this, and I say this with great confidence and also with a heavy heart. And I hope that I am as transparent as possible and that you can identify with me. Sometimes situations, even as your pastor, just feels bigger than me. And there are things that I struggle with now that I wish God would just remove. I wish he would just take away. Sometimes I'm in places in my life where I'm saying, God, please do something. I'm not talking about when everyone's in the room. I'm talking about when you're by yourself. When the day is almost over and you have those few moments before you hit the bed. Those few moments before you begin to lay down and you just wish, and you're just honest with yourself and you say, I should be a lot further than where I am. And I see you bless everybody else. I see some people in the same situation as me getting more than what I currently got. How come you aren't doing for me, let's be honest, what I see you doing for people who don't even believe in you? And it's these moments where I'm really like, are you kidding me? And it's in these moments where I have to hear, like, you got to get real still, because the worst thing you can do is begin to compare your calling to someone else's chapter. Hear me. Where you start looking at your life and your prayer is based off of being where someone else is, wanting to accomplish what they got, seeing where they are. You have a calling on your life. God has designed you for something that's just for you. And oftentimes what we do is we look at where other people are and say, man, I should be further. But God has something just for you. You can't compare your call to someone else's chapter, to someone else's highlight reel on social media. A manufactured moment has now become your greatest misery. And here's what I heard God saying, and this is really all that I wanted to tell you this morning, is that it's in those moments where we really just say, God, what's up? And he says back, I I just want you to know I'm real. I just want you to know that you don't need anything else but my presence. Allow my presence to change this situation. You see, it's the grace of, Paul said the grace of God is sufficient. When you allow God to lean into your life, it then begins to make some of the toughest situations more bearable. And people begin to say, man, how are you able to walk around with a smile on your face knowing your situation is, I don't know, it's the grace of God. How are you able to keep it and hold it together when your husband is at home acting crazy? It's the grace of God. Don't you miss your kids? Why haven't they come back? Are you still able to hold it together? It's the grace of God. I can't explain it to you. It's the grace of God. You're not tripping yet. You ain't getting to the school of your choice, and you're not tripping. Don't you know we got to pick schools in a couple of weeks? It's the grace of God. I trust him. I trust him. I know that he is all that I need. It's the grace of God. I can't really explain to you why I'm at peace, but I just know that God's grace is sufficient. And even when it doesn't look like it's going to come together, even when it doesn't look like everything's going to be okay, it's the grace of God that allows me to endure. How do I get this grace? How do I get to a place where I can feel the grace of God that you're talking about? It's so simple. I love this. He said, just be still and know that I am God. And sometimes you got to look at your situation. I can't call my friend. I can't call my mom. I can't call anyone else. I just got to sit still and know God, you're in control. You didn't answer this the way I wanted it answered, but I still trust you. I know your grace is sufficient. Bow your heads.